A father and his little girl set out for a weekend trip in the Cascade Mountains back in 1999, and they vanished without leaving a single trace. Search teams found nothing, not even the Jeep they were driving. For 9 years, the forest stayed silent. But when a drone operator spotted something strange hidden beneath the trees, the case cracked wide open. What was found deep in those mountains was not the closure anyone expected. It was the start of a far darker mystery. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this kind of story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. In the autumn of 1999, Richard Hayes loaded his old Jeep Cherokee for a weekend trip into the Cascade Mountains. His 8-year-old daughter Claire skipped excitedly around the driveway, holding the bright red scarf she never left behind. His wife Margaret stood on the porch watching them, her hands tucked tightly around a coffee mug. Richard promised her they would be back by Sunday evening, smiling in that confident way he always did when he set out on an adventure. Margaret waved as the Jeep rolled down the quiet street, the sound of gravel crunching under the tires fading into the distance. That was the last time she saw them. When Sunday night came and went with no sign of Richard and Claire, Margaret called the ranger station in a panic. By dawn, search teams were already combing the mountain roads. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across endless green canopies, while volunteers pushed through brambles and snow-dusted trails. For days they searched, but no tire tracks, no backpacks, not even a piece of fabric from Claire's scarf was found. The Jeep had simply disappeared. Margaret clung to the phone through every update, her hopes slowly draining as one search after another ended empty. By the following year, the official search was called off. Margaret refused to accept it. She paid for flyers with Richard and Claire's photographs, taping them to gas station windows and pinning them to bulletin boards and ranger stations. She called the sheriff's office every few months. Even when she knew the answer would be the same, there was nothing new. Each October, on the date they had vanished, Margaret lit a candle in her front window, whispering her daughter's name into the still night air, as if the mountain wind might carry it to her. Over time, the story of Richard and Claire Hayes became a dark legend in the Cascade towns. Some locals swore the Jeep had tumbled into one of the hidden gorges where no rescuer could ever reach. Others suggested a stranger on the remote roads had stopped them, and the mountains had kept the secret ever since. Margaret heard every theory, but none of them gave her peace. For 9 years, the forest remained silent, holding its secret tight, while she carried on with the weight of not knowing. In the summer of 2008, a man named Alan Becker was testing out a new drone he had bought near the southern edge of the Cascade Range. He wasn't looking for anything unusual, just flying the machine over the steep ravines and ridgelines for the thrill of capturing aerial footage. The camera buzzed above thick trees, dipping lower into a stretch of valley that hikers rarely visited. At first, the footage showed nothing but moss, shadows, and endless green. Then the lens caught a strange glimmer, something metallic half buried among fallen branches and rock. Alan steadied the drone and circled back, zooming in on the shape. It was pale, rusted, and oddly square. The more he looked, the more certain he became that it was the roof of a vehicle. Alan saved the video and took it to the ranger station the next morning. The rangers were skeptical, but when they slowed the footage, the shape became clearer. Through layers of dirt and moss, a faint outline of a Jeep emerged. Margaret Hayes was called immediately. After 9 years of silence, her phone rang with the words she'd been waiting for and dreading at the same time. "We think we've found something." Margaret could barely hold the receiver steady as the ranger explained the discovery. Her mind spun with images she had buried long ago. Richard's confident smile, Claire tugging her red scarf into a knot, the Jeep rolling away for what was meant to be a simple weekend trip. Within hours, she was on the road to the Cascades, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. For the first time in almost a decade, the forest was about to give something back. The climb to the site was not easy. Rangers guided Margaret through dense brush, over slippery rocks, and down into the narrow ravine where the drone had caught its strange reflection. Police tape had already been strung between trees, and deputies moved carefully around the scene, cameras flashing in the dim light under the canopy. When Margaret stepped forward, she froze. There, wedged between boulders and covered in moss, lay the crushed shell of a Jeep Cherokee. The windows were shattered, the paint dulled by time, but she knew it instantly. It was Richard's Jeep. Her knees nearly gave out as she pressed a hand against a tree to steady herself. 9 years of waiting, 9 years of unanswered questions, and now the car was here. Yet the sight didn't bring relief. Instead, dread crept into her chest. Something was missing. The doors had rusted, but were forced open by the recovery team, revealing the interior caked with dirt and leaves. The seats were torn, but they were empty. No trace of Richard, no trace of Claire. Then an officer pulled out a small object from beneath the collapsed back seat. It was a child's backpack, the fabric faded but still intact. Margaret recognized the pattern of cartoon stars that her daughter had begged for in the store. She covered her mouth with trembling hands. Inside the bag was a water bottle, a notebook with several pages ripped out, and a pair of shoelaces knotted together. No bones, no clothes, no bodies, only these silent belongings left behind in the dark hollow of the wreck. The Jeep had been found, but Richard and Claire were still nowhere in sight. For hours, investigators combed the area around the Jeep. They measured skid marks on the rocky slope, studied broken branches, and searched for any sign of where Richard and Claire might have gone after the crash. The vehicle looked as if it had slid down from a higher ridge, tumbling end over end before settling in the ravine. But one detail puzzled everyone. The driver's side door was unlocked, and the passenger door had been left slightly ajar, as though someone had opened it after the fall. If Richard and Claire had survived the crash, then where had they gone? Margaret stood nearby, clutching her daughter's backpack against her chest, unwilling to let it out of her sight. The sheriff approached gently, explaining that the notebook inside the bag had several pages torn out, as if someone had removed them deliberately. That single detail gnawed at Margaret. Why would Claire rip pages from her notebook in the middle of a trip? And if the crash had been the end, why weren't those pages scattered among the debris? As the search widened, one of the deputies called out from the ridge above the Jeep. He had spotted a piece of fabric snagged on a tree branch. When he climbed higher and cut it free, the red cloth fluttered in his hand. Margaret's breath caught. She knew that scarf. Claire had worn it the morning they left. She had wrapped it twice around her small neck and tied it stubbornly herself, refusing her father's help. Margaret took the scarf, pressing it to her face, but something about it was wrong. The fibers looked too fresh, too bright, as if they hadn't spent 9 years out in the wind and rain. The sheriff examined it closely. He agreed it was odd. The fabric should have been faded or shredded, but instead it seemed newer, almost as though someone had placed it there much later. Margaret's heart began to pound. Had someone returned to this crash site years after the disappearance? If so, why? And who could it have been? The forest around them felt suddenly heavier, the silence of the Cascades pressing down as if the trees themselves were listening. Margaret glanced at the backpack in her arms, then back to the Jeep. 9 years of mystery had just grown stranger. The vehicle answered one question, but the red scarf raised 100 more. The sheriff ordered his deputies to sweep a wider radius around the ravine. They moved methodically, flagging every scrap of cloth, every broken twig, every footprint in the soft ground. Margaret followed slowly behind them, her eyes scanning the earth for anything that might have belonged to her daughter. The air smelled damp with moss, and the calls of crows echoed in the trees above. It was the kind of place where sound carried strangely, where even the smallest movement seemed magnified. Every few minutes, Margaret thought she heard the crunch of something in the distance, but when she turned, there was only stillness. One of the rangers discovered a makeshift trail a short distance from the Jeep. It wasn't part of any marked hiking route. The soil had been disturbed, faint but visible, and there were stones stacked in a way that looked deliberate, as though guiding someone along a hidden path. The team followed it cautiously, moving deeper into the forest. Margaret's grip on the scarf tightened as she walked, each step heavier than the last. The trail led to a small clearing where the ground dipped into a hollow. At the edge of the clearing sat the charred remains of an old campfire. Scattered around it were rusted cans, broken glass, and the frame of a child's folding chair collapsed into the dirt. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. She recognized the chair immediately. It had been packed into the Jeep the morning Richard left. She remembered Claire running her hands over the bright blue fabric when it was brand new, insisting she would sit in it by the fire that weekend. Now it was here, rotted and bent, but unmistakably theirs. A deputy knelt beside the fire pit and brushed away ash with a gloved hand. Beneath the blackened wood, something small gleamed. He picked it up and held it to the light. It was a silver hair clip shaped like a butterfly. Margaret's heart sank. She remembered fastening that clip into Claire's hair on her first day of school. Remembered her daughter's shy smile in the class photo, where it had sparkled under the camera flash. She reached for it with shaking fingers, but the deputy didn't let it go right away. He pointed out a troubling detail. The clip wasn't rusted, and it bore almost no signs of 9 harsh winters in the Cascades. That same uneasiness spread through the group. First the scarf, now the hair clip. Both seemed far too preserved to have sat in the wilderness since 1999. The sheriff's face tightened. "Someone has been here more recently," he said under his breath, though Margaret heard every word. Her knees went weak, and she clutched the scarf tighter against her chest. The search continued beyond the clearing, and after a short distance, they reached the remnants of an old hunter's shack, half hidden by thick brush. Its roof sagged under years of snow, and ivy wound up through broken window frames. Margaret stared at it, her stomach twisting with a fear she couldn't quite explain. The shack looked abandoned, but something about the way the door hung slightly open made it feel like they had just interrupted someone. Inside, the floor was damp, the air heavy with mold. Broken furniture was piled against the walls, and scattered across a table were scraps of paper, too smudged to read. A single lantern sat on the floor, its fuel long gone. But next to it lay stabbed, something that froze Margaret in place. A page torn from a child's notebook. The handwriting was unmistakable. Large, uneven letters spelled out a single word: help. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. She remembered Claire's handwriting, the way she formed her letters with careful strokes, often writing larger than the lines allowed. The sheriff took the page and slipped it carefully into an evidence bag, but Margaret couldn't look away. The scarf, the hair clip, the chair, and now this. Each discovery pulled her further into a reality she had never dared imagine. Richard and Claire hadn't simply vanished into the mountain. Someone had been here, someone who had kept their secret for almost a decade. And standing in the shadow of that broken shack, Margaret felt certain of one thing. The forest hadn't been empty all those years. Someone had been watching. That night, Margaret stayed in a small cabin near the ranger station. The authorities insisted she rest, but sleep would not come. She sat at the edge of the bed with the red scarf draped over her lap and the butterfly clip placed carefully on the table beside her. She kept glancing at them as though they might vanish if she looked away. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Claire's face. Older now in her imagination, yet still carrying the same bright eyes she had last seen in 1999. The silence in the cabin pressed down on her chest, broken only by the occasional sound of branches scraping the roof. At dawn, she returned to the ranger station where investigators had gathered around the drone operator, Alan Becker. They replayed his footage over and over, pausing at the frame where the Jeep's roof shimmered through the trees. But as Alan went frame by frame, something strange appeared. Off to the side, just for a second, a dark outline stood among the trees. At first it looked like nothing more than a shadow, but when they magnified the image, the shape became clearer. It was tall, human-like, and angled toward the drone, almost as though watching it. The figure was blurred, but it was undeniably there. Margaret leaned forward, her heart pounding. The height, the broad shoulders, it reminded her of Richard. For 9 years she had imagined him gone, yet here was a figure that made her question everything. But how could it be him? If Richard had survived, why hadn't he come home? Why had Claire never been returned? The sheriff studied the image in silence. Finally he spoke, saying the figure could have been a hunter or even a trick of the light, but his tone betrayed doubt. He ordered his deputies to return to the site with dogs. If anyone had been living near the ravine, there would be signs. Margaret insisted on going too. When they arrived, the forest was quiet, heavy with mist. The dogs sniffed furiously around the old shack and along the faint trail that led deeper into the woods. After an hour, one of them began barking sharply near a patch of overgrowth. Deputies rushed forward and uncovered a rusted tin box buried in the soil. Inside were scraps of cloth, a small cracked mirror, and something that froze everyone in place. A photograph. The picture was faded but recognizable. It showed Claire sitting on a log near a fire, older than she had been in 1999. Her hair was longer, her face more mature, but it was her without question. And beside her sat a man, his head turned slightly, but the mustache and strong jawline were painfully familiar. Margaret dropped to her knees when she saw it. Richard was alive. He had been with Claire years after the world believed them dead. The deputies exchanged troubled looks. If Richard had survived with Claire, where were they now? And why had no one come forward in nearly a decade? Margaret clutched the photo in trembling hands. It was proof her daughter had lived past that night, but the man beside her raised terrifying questions. Had Richard been protecting Claire or keeping her hidden? The sheriff put a hand on Margaret's shoulder, promising they would find answers, but his expression was grim. The forest had kept its secret too well, and now it seemed to whisper a darker truth. That Richard and Claire had not been lost to the mountains at all. They had been living in its shadows. And somewhere out there, someone still wanted that secret buried. The photograph spread through the sheriff's office like wildfire. Deputies leaned over one another to confirm what their eyes already knew. Claire had lived years beyond the crash, and Richard had been with her. The photo was carefully preserved despite its age, as if someone had meant for it to survive. Margaret sat quietly in the corner of the room, the scarf clutched tightly in her lap. Her eyes never left the image. Claire's small smile in that photo was haunting, soft, uncertain, and nothing like the carefree grin she remembered from 1999. The child she had kissed goodbye that morning had grown into someone she barely recognized. Word traveled quickly through the small towns that bordered the Cascades. Locals came forward with stories they had kept to themselves for years. One old hunter swore he had seen a man with a young girl walking through the backcountry in 2003. He said the man avoided eye contact, guiding the girl away when they spotted his rifle slung over his shoulder. At the time, he thought it was just a father and daughter camping where they shouldn't, but after seeing the photograph, his memory sharpened. The girl's red scarf, he said, had caught his attention. Another hiker recalled stumbling across a makeshift camp deep in the forest, scattered with toys and clothing far too small for an adult. When he returned the next season, the camp was gone, leaving only flattened grass and ashes. Margaret listened to each account with a mix of dread and desperate hope. Every story suggested the same truth. Richard and Claire had not vanished completely. They had been out there, alive, moving like shadows between the trees while the world mourned them. But the details raised chilling questions. Why would Richard keep Claire hidden? Why had they never reached out for help? Investigators returned to the shack where the torn notebook page had been found. This time, they searched the ground more thoroughly, prying up loose floorboards and digging into the soil beneath. Under one rotted plank, they uncovered a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were several personal items, a child's shoe with worn laces, a set of camping utensils, and another page from the same notebook. The paper was stained, but the words were legible. Written in Claire's uneven letters were the words, "I want to go home." Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she read it. The sheriff placed the page gently into a plastic sleeve, but his hands trembled. He looked at Margaret with grave eyes and said softly, "She wrote this years after the crash. Someone was keeping her here." As the evidence piled up, the sheriff brought in specialists from the state to assist. They analyzed the scarf and hair clip, confirming that both had likely been placed near the Jeep within the past 2 years, not 9. That meant someone had been deliberately moving reminders of Claire into plain sight, as though marking a trail or sending a warning. Margaret began to feel the weight of eyes on her wherever she went. At the gas station near the ranger station, she noticed a man in a baseball cap staring too long before driving away without pumping gas. At the diner, a waitress mentioned that a stranger had been asking questions about the woman looking for her missing family. The uneasy sense of being followed grew stronger with each passing day. Late one evening, Alan Becker, the drone operator, stopped by the cabin where Margaret was staying. He carried his laptop and looked pale. He explained he had been reviewing older footage he had taken in the Cascades months before he ever spotted the Jeep. On one of those flights, nearly at the edge of his camera's range, a figure appeared briefly in a clearing. When he froze the frame, the image made Margaret's blood run cold. It was a girl with long brown hair standing rigid, her head turned toward the sky as though she had heard the drone above her. Her face was blurred, but the shape of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, Margaret knew it was Claire. The sheriff studied the footage in silence, his expression tightening with every passing second. Finally, he exhaled and said, "This means she was alive not long ago. Someone has been keeping her in these mountains, and whoever it is, they're still out there." Margaret pressed her hands against her face, torn between relief and terror. For 9 years she had begged for proof that Claire lived. Now she had it. But along with that proof came the sickening realization that her daughter had been living under someone's control, close enough for strangers to catch fleeting glimpses, yet never free to come home. And if Richard truly was the man in that photograph, then the most painful question of all remained. Had he been her protector or her captor? The sheriff gathered his deputies the next morning and pushed the search farther into the backcountry. He believed the shack and the trail of belongings were only fragments of a much larger pattern. Margaret insisted on coming, refusing to wait behind. She had carried 9 years of silence, and she would not sit idle now that the forest was finally speaking. The group hiked for hours, their boots sinking into damp soil, their breaths visible in the cool air. The Cascades were vast and unforgiving, a maze of ridges and valleys where a person could vanish and never be found. By midday, one of the deputies spotted something strange ahead, a string of rocks carefully lined along the base of a ridge. They weren't natural. Each one was stacked in a way that suggested purpose, like someone had been marking a path. The line of stones led into a narrow gorge where the trees closed in and the sunlight barely reached. The ground was soft with pine needles, muffling their steps, and the silence felt heavier the farther they went. At the end of the gorge stood a cabin, larger than the broken shack they had found before, sturdier too. The roof sagged under years of snow, but smoke stains clung to the chimney bricks. Margaret froze when she saw it. Something about the structure felt wrong. The windows had been boarded, the door reinforced with an extra plank nailed across it. Whoever had lived there hadn't wanted to be seen. The sheriff signaled for caution as his deputies circled the perimeter. Margaret stayed close, clutching Claire's scarf in her hands. Through the cracks in the boards, one deputy peered inside. His face paled. He whispered that the interior wasn't empty. It was furnished. There was a mattress pushed against the wall, shelves stocked with canned food, and drawings pinned to the wood. The door creaked when they pushed it open. The air inside was stale, heavy with the odor of damp wood and rusted metal. Margaret's eyes went straight to the drawings tacked to the wall. Her chest tightened when she saw them. They were crude sketches made with pencil, the kind a child would draw. One showed a girl standing beside a tall man. Another showed a small cabin surrounded by trees. The last sketch was darker. It showed a figure standing outside the window with no face, only a black outline. On a table in the corner sat a row of glass jars, each filled with odd trinkets, buttons, bits of cloth, pieces of ribbon. Margaret's fingers shook as she picked one up. Inside, at the bottom, lay a plastic bead shaped like a star. She remembered Claire stringing beads like that onto a bracelet the summer before she vanished. The bracelet had never been found. Then one deputy called out from the back of the cabin. Beneath a loose floorboard, he had uncovered a second bundle wrapped in a faded towel. When he opened it, silence fell across the room. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all carefully tucked together. Some were blurry, others clearer, but they all showed the same girl at different ages, Claire. In one, she was roasting a marshmallow. In another, she was sitting by a stream, her knees tucked to her chest. She looked older in each, her expression vacant, as if the light in her eyes had slowly dimmed over the years. But one photo chilled Margaret to the bone. It showed Richard standing behind Claire, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder. His face was partially obscured, but his stance was unmistakable. He looked older, his hair streaked with gray, but it was him. The question that had haunted Margaret twisted darker in her mind. Had Richard kept Claire hidden here, away from everyone? Or had someone else forced them into this life, using him to control her? The sheriff carefully collected the photographs, but Margaret couldn't move. Her hands trembled as she stared at the last picture in the stack, the one taken most recently. Claire looked no more than a year older than she would be now, which meant that somewhere, very close, she was likely still alive. As they filed out of the cabin, the deputies discovered fresh tracks in the mud near the rear entrance. They weren't old like the others. They were recent, the edges sharp. Someone had been here within the past day. Margaret's pulse raced. She clutched the scarf against her chest, eyes darting into the trees. For the first time in years, she felt certain. Claire was near, and whoever had been with her all these years might still be watching from the shadows. The discovery of the fresh footprints changed everything. The deputies no longer moved at the steady pace of investigators. They became hunters, alert to every snapped twig and shifted stone. The sheriff ordered silence as they followed the trail into the deeper woods, rifles ready, eyes scanning for movement. Margaret stayed close despite their warnings, her fingers curled tightly around the scarf in her hand, as though it were a lifeline. Every step forward felt like stepping into the heart of the mystery that had consumed her for nearly a decade. The prince led them along a narrow stream where the banks were soft with mud. Here the tracks grew clearer. One set was larger, heavy, pressed deep into the earth. The other was smaller, lighter, the shape of a young woman's shoe. Margaret's knees nearly buckled when she saw it. Claire was no longer a little girl. She would have been 17 now, nearly grown, but seeing those prints side by side made her heart ache. Her daughter had walked this path not long ago. The trail curved uphill toward a dense grove of cedar trees. As they climbed, the sheriff paused and raised his hand. Something was glinting from the branches above. One deputy aimed his flashlight and revealed a small bell tied to a string. More bells were hidden among the branches, carefully arranged as if to warn someone inside the grove of approaching footsteps. Whoever lived here had been prepared, cautious, and smart enough to set up alarms. The sheriff motioned to cut the strings quietly, but the metallic ring of one bell slipped free, echoing through the trees. The forest fell silent. Even the birds seemed to vanish. Then, faintly, came the crack of a branch snapping in the distance. The deputies froze, weapons raised. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Someone was out there, listening, watching, perhaps deciding whether to flee or confront them. They pressed on quickly, following the footprints deeper into the grove. Soon they reached a small clearing where smoke still curled faintly from a campfire. Around it were signs of recent activity: a kettle half filled with water, a bedroll laid out on the ground, and a canvas bag propped against a log. Margaret's eyes locked onto the bag. She recognized the faded sticker on its side. A butterfly, the same one Claire had plastered on her schoolbooks before she disappeared. She rushed forward before the deputies could stop her. Kneeling beside the bag, she pulled it open with trembling hands. Inside were clothes neatly folded, a flashlight, and a small journal with pages filled in that same uneven handwriting. Margaret flipped to the first entry, her tears falling fast. The date scrawled at the top read 2002. The words beneath it were short but cut through her like a knife. He says we can't go home yet. The sheriff took the journal gently from her hands, scanning further. Each entry grew more desperate, Claire's handwriting slanting, smudged with tears or dirt. Some lines pleaded for freedom. Others sounded resigned. I miss Mom. He says the world forgot about us. Then, on one of the most recent pages, written shakily, I think he's lying. I heard voices in the forest last week. I don't think we're alone. Before Margaret could react, the sound of footsteps thundered from the opposite side of the clearing. Deputies spun, weapons raised, shouting commands into the trees. A figure bolted between the cedars, tall and quick, vanishing like smoke. Another, smaller figure followed but stumbled briefly before being yanked forward by the first. Margaret screamed Claire's name, her voice tearing through the silence. The smaller figure hesitated for the briefest second at the sound, her head turning just slightly. Before the tall figure dragged her deeper into the woods, chaos erupted. Deputies charged after them, the sheriff barking orders, the forest alive with the sound of pursuit. Margaret stumbled forward, desperate to follow, her eyes fixed on the fading glimpse of long hair and a flash of red fabric. After 9 years of waiting, Claire was no longer a memory or a photograph. She was here, alive, within reach, and someone was determined to keep her hidden still. The encolded forest exploded with noise as deputies crashed through the underbrush, their flashlights slicing across the darkness. Margaret stumbled after them, her lungs burning, her legs struggling to keep pace, but she refused to stop. The sound of snapping branches echoed ahead. Whoever had taken Claire was moving fast, desperate to stay ahead of the law. The sheriff shouted for his men to split, half circling left, half right, to cut off escape. Margaret stayed on the trail, the scarf clutched so tightly in her hand that her knuckles were white. The smaller figure darting through the trees faltered again, just for a second, and Margaret caught another glimpse. Long hair tangled around her shoulders, the outline of a thin frame. Even after all these years, Margaret knew it was Claire. Her daughter's gait, the way she leaned forward when she ran, it was her. But the larger figure yanked her along roughly, forcing her deeper into the forest. A deputy shouted a warning, and a single gunshot cracked in the night, striking the ground near the fleeing pair. They did not stop. The chase pushed into a ravine where the ground dropped steeply. Margaret skidded down the slope, dirt filling her shoes, branches tearing at her arms. At the bottom, the deputies found another campsite. This one was darker, more sinister. A crude lean-to made of branches sagged near the fire pit, and animal bones were scattered across the ground. Rope hung from a tree limb, frayed and stiff from years of use. The sheriff barked at his men to check every corner. Margaret's eyes fell on a small box, shoved into the dirt beside the fire pit. She pulled it open with trembling fingers. Inside lay Polaroid photographs, grainy, faded, but unmistakable. Each photo was of Claire. Some were simple, her sitting on a rock, walking through the trees. Others made Margaret's stomach twist. Images of her daughter staring blankly into the camera, her expression vacant, almost as though someone had forced her to pose. In one picture, Claire's hands were bound in front of her with rope. Margaret dropped the box, her body shaking. The sheriff cursed under his breath, his jaw tight with fury. A deputy suddenly yelled from the far side of the ravine. He had spotted movement, a flash of fabric disappearing into a hidden trail that wound upward through the rocks. The team surged forward again, climbing quickly, their lights bouncing wildly. Margaret followed, her legs trembling, but she would not let them out of her sight. At the top of the trail, the trees thinned, opening to a clearing lit by the pale glow of the moon. And there, standing just beyond the line of trees, was a man. He was older now, his beard streaked with gray, his clothes torn and filthy. But Margaret knew him instantly. Her heart stopped. It was Richard. For 9 years she had dreamed of seeing him again, imagined him walking through the front door. Now here he was, standing at the edge of the clearing with Claire pressed tightly against his side, his hand gripping her arm like a vice. "Richard!" Margaret's cry tore through the clearing, her voice raw. He turned his head, his eyes catching the light from the deputies' flashlights. There was something hollow in his expression, something Margaret had never seen before. He didn't look like the man she had married, the father who used to swing Claire high into the air. He looked like a stranger. The sheriff raised his rifle and shouted for Richard to release the girl. Deputies echoed the command, their voices sharp, weapons trained. Richard didn't move. His grip on Claire only tightened as she turned her face toward Margaret. In the pale moonlight, Margaret saw the tears on her daughter's cheeks, saw her lips part soundlessly, as though she was trying to form a word she no longer remembered how to say. Richard finally spoke, his voice rough, as though it had not been used in years. "You don't understand," he said. "You can't take her back. Not now. She's not the same anymore." Margaret felt her knees weaken. Her husband's words sounded less like a warning and more like a confession. The deputies inched forward, their rifles steady. The sheriff shouted again, telling Richard to let go. For a heartbeat, everything went still. No wind, no sound, only the sight of a man clutching his daughter, as though the forest itself demanded he never let her go. Then Richard pulled something from his jacket, a pistol, old and worn. He raised it toward the deputies, his other hand still locked around Claire's arm. Chaos erupted. Deputies shouted, flashlights swayed, Margaret screamed. Claire flinched and stumbled, caught between her father's grasp and the arms of the men trying to save her. The sheriff barked a final command. Margaret's heart hammered as the night hung in balance. The moment that would decide everything, the truth of what Richard had done and whether Claire would finally be free, was about to break. The clearing erupted with shouts, deputies crouched low, rifles fixed on Richard, the air thick with tension. Margaret stood frozen, the scarf slipping from her hands into the dirt. Her voice cracked as she cried out again, pleading with Richard to let Claire go, begging him to lower the gun. But he didn't move, didn't blink. His grip on the pistol was steady, his other arm clamped tightly around his daughter's thin shoulders. Claire trembled against him. In the pale moonlight, her face looked pale, her eyes wide but distant, as if she was caught between fear and something deeper, something that had been carved into her over 9 long years. She turned her head slightly, her gaze locking with her mother's. For the first time since the chase began, Margaret felt a spark of recognition. Claire's lips moved soundlessly, and Margaret strained to read them. The faintest whisper escaped. "Help me." The sheriff's voice cut through the silence. "Richard Hayes, put the weapon down now," released the girl. His tone was sharp, every word deliberate. The deputies fanned out slowly, moving to encircle the clearing. The night hummed with the click of safeties being released. Richard's expression twisted. "You don't know what you're doing," he rasped, his voice carrying years of bitterness. "You think you're rescuing her? You think you're saving her? You don't understand what's out here." His eyes burned as they shifted from the sheriff to Margaret. "You never understood." Margaret stepped forward before anyone could stop her. "Richard, please," she said, her voice breaking. "That's our daughter. She's been gone for so long. Let her come home. Let her live." Richard shook his head violently. "Home?" he spat. "There is no home. Not anymore. They were watching us, Margaret. They were following us from the start. I kept her safe. I kept her hidden from them." His hand trembled slightly on the pistol, though he tightened his hold on Claire. "If I hadn't, they would have taken her. They would have taken both of us." The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. Margaret felt her chest tighten. His words sounded like the ramblings of a man driven half-mad by isolation. But there was something in his eyes, fear, not anger, that chilled her. "Richard," she whispered. "Who's they?" Richard's eyes darted toward the dark line of trees beyond the clearing. For a moment, Margaret thought she saw something flicker there, a movement in the shadows. Her heart raced. Richard lowered his voice, almost to a whisper. "They don't want her leaving. They don't want anyone knowing. I've been fighting them all these years." The sheriff stepped forward, his rifle still raised. "You're not making sense, Richard. Put the weapon down before someone gets hurt." Richard's jaw clenched. "You think I'm crazy," he growled. "But you haven't seen what I've seen." He yanked Claire closer and she stumbled, her small cry slicing through the night. Margaret's blood ran cold. Every instinct in her body screamed to run forward, to tear her daughter free, but the line of rifles between them held her back. Suddenly, a deputy at the edge of the clearing shouted. He swore he'd seen movement in the trees, 2 figures slipping between the branches. All eyes flicked toward the dark forest. For a split second, Richard's mask cracked. His eyes widened and true panic flooded his face. He jerked the pistol upward, firing a wild shot into the trees. The sound split the night, echoing across the ridges. Birds exploded from the canopy. Claire screamed, clutching her ears. The deputies rushed forward, but Richard staggered back, dragging Claire with him. "Stay away!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "You'll lead them right to us." His words came out ragged, almost hysterical now. Margaret could barely breathe. Every part of her wanted to believe. Richard was simply broken, a man lost to years of solitude. But the terror in his eyes, the frantic way he scanned the forest, it was the look of someone who truly believed danger was closing in. The sheriff barked another order. "Drop it now, Richard." Richard's gaze shifted once more to Margaret. His eyes softened for a flicker of a moment, the ghost of the man she once knew breaking through. "I did it for her," he whispered. "Everything I did was for her." His voice cracked, but they never stopped following. He turned sharply, dragging Claire toward a narrow path at the far edge of the clearing. Deputies lunged to block him, but he fired again, forcing them back with sparks of gunfire. The blast illuminated his face, lined and worn, a man consumed by years of fear. Claire stumbled again, her cry echoing as she was pulled into the shadows. Margaret screamed her daughter's name and tried to rush after them, but deputies restrained her, pulling her back. "It's not safe," one hissed, his voice trembling. The night filled with the pounding of boots as the sheriff split his men again, half pursuing Richard and Claire into the forest, half securing the clearing. Margaret's eyes darted back to the tree line where Richard had fired. For an instant, she swore she saw shapes there, tall, unmoving, watching. But when she blinked, the space was empty. The forest swallowed the sound of pursuit, leaving only Margaret's ragged breathing and the scarf lying abandoned at her feet. The forest was alive with pursuit. Shouts from the deputies bounced off the ridges, flashlights cut jagged beams across the undergrowth, and the thud of boots pounded the soil in unison. Margaret's heart hammered as she stumbled behind them, her lungs burning with cold air. She refused to let herself be pulled away now, not when her daughter was only steps from freedom after nearly a decade of silence. Every part of her body screamed to collapse, to stop, but her determination was stronger. Richard was ahead, dragging Claire down the narrow trail that twisted deeper into the Cascades. His grip on her arm was desperate, almost frantic, but his head kept turning, his eyes darting into the dark beyond the trees as if expecting something to burst forth at any moment. Claire stumbled often, her thin frame unable to match his pace, yet each time she faltered, he yanked her forward with a rough pull. Her face was pale in the flashlight beams that briefly caught her. Her lips moved as if she was whispering something Margaret could not hear. "Stop him!" the sheriff's voice boomed from behind. "Don't let him get out of sight." Two deputies surged ahead, trying to flank Richard, but he raised his pistol again and fired wildly into the night. The shots ricocheted off rocks, sending fragments flying. The echoes rolled through the gorge like thunder. Margaret screamed Claire's name, her voice cracking as it disappeared into the chaos. Split second, Claire's head jerked back at the sound, her eyes locking with her mother's across the divide. There was recognition, a plea, and something else. Fear not of the deputies, but of whatever her father had warned her about for years. Richard's path led upward, climbing into a section of forest where the trees thickened, their branches interlocking above to form a suffocating canopy. Here, the beams of flashlights grew weak, swallowed by the density of the woods. Deputies cursed as they tripped over roots, their progress slowing. Richard seemed to know the ground better than any of them, weaving through narrow paths with Claire clutched close. He moved like a man who had lived in this wilderness too long, like the forest itself had shaped his instincts. Suddenly, one deputy called out. He had found a crude rope bridge spanning a gorge between two ridges. Its planks were rotten, its ropes frayed, but fresh footprints smeared with mud marked its surface. Richard had taken Claire across. The deputies hesitated. One tested the bridge, and the wood groaned under his weight. The sheriff barked for caution, but Margaret did not wait. Her heart leapt into her throat as she ran to the edge of the gorge. The drop beneath was dizzying, a sheer black emptiness that seemed to have no bottom. She looked across and saw, faintly in the moonlight, Richard pulling Claire toward the far ridge. "Claire!" Margaret screamed, her voice tearing from her throat. Claire twisted in her father's grasp. This time she called back, her voice hoarse but sharp. "Mom! Claire, she turning!" The sound shattered Margaret's restraint. She stepped onto the bridge before anyone could stop her. The planks groaned under her weight. The ropes swayed, but she pressed forward, her eyes locked on her daughter. Deputies shouted warnings behind her, the sheriff's voice carrying fury and fear, but she did not care. For 9 years, she had lived with silence. Now, she had heard her daughter's voice again, and nothing would stop her. On the far side, Richard spun at the sound. His face was a mask of conflict, rage, and despair. He raised the pistol again, pointing it, not at the deputies, not at Margaret, but at the forest behind her. His hands shook violently as he shouted, "They're here, you brought them with you." The deputies froze, scanning the trees. Margaret turned instinctively, but saw only shadows and the swaying tops of the pines. Her breath quickened. Richard fired again into the darkness, the muzzle flash lighting his face in a grotesque flicker. Claire cried out, covering her ears. "Who, Richard?" Margaret screamed, her voice raw. "Who are you talking about?" Richard's eyes blazed with a kind of terror that made Margaret's blood run cold. "They never stopped," he shouted. "You thought it was an accident? You thought the Jeep just slid? No, they forced us off the road. They've been hunting us ever since, and you led them straight. Here." His words sent a ripple through the deputies. Several exchanged uneasy glances, their weapons still raised, but their focus shifting to the tree line. Margaret's chest tightened. Could it be true? Was Richard mad, or had he really been hiding from something all these years? The sheriff stepped forward, his voice steady though his knuckles were white around his rifle. "Richard, you need to stop this." Whatever happened out here, it ends tonight. Let her go. For the first time, Richard's grip on Claire faltered. She tugged against him, her eyes wide with desperation. "Please, Dad," she whispered. "I want to go home." The words were soft, but they cut through the clearing like a blade. Richard staggered as if the plea had struck him physically. His pistol wavered. His eyes darted between Claire, Margaret, and the woods. His voice cracked. "Home isn't safe," he muttered. "They'll find you. They'll find all of us." The sheriff raised his rifle higher. "Drop the gun, Richard." Margaret inched forward, her steps slow and steady, her hands open in front of her. "Richard," she said softly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's me. It's Margaret. Look at her. She's begging you. She needs her father to let her go." For a moment, Richard's shoulders slumped. His face softened, the haunted look easing, and Margaret felt a flicker of hope. But then a snapping branch shattered the silence from deep within the woods. Every head turned. The deputies swung their rifles toward the sound. Margaret's stomach dropped. Something was moving out there. Richard's face twisted in panic again. He shoved Claire behind him, raising the pistol toward the trees. "They're here," he shouted, his voice breaking. "Don't you see? They never left us alone." Before Margaret could cry out, a blinding beam of a flashlight burst from the opposite ridge, followed by the echo of more snapping branches. Figures were moving, several quick and deliberate. Deputies shouted, some firing into the air, others rushing to reposition. The forest exploded into chaos. Richard screamed in fury and fear, dragging Claire toward the tree line. Claire cried for her mother, her voice piercing the cacophony. Margaret lunged forward, reaching the far side of the bridge, just as the sheriff fired a warning shot that cracked the night in half. The bullet struck the dirt inches from Richard's feet. He froze, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. For a heartbeat, everything held still, the forest, the deputies, Margaret's pounding heart. Then Richard turned, his face a mask of anguish, and whispered something only Claire could hear. He shoved her forward, hard, sending her stumbling into Margaret's arms. The force of it knocked Margaret back, but she caught her daughter, clutching her as if she would never let go again. Claire's body shook with sobs, her face buried against her mother's chest. Margaret wrapped both arms around her, trembling with relief and terror. Richard stepped backward toward the dark wall of trees, his pistol still raised. His eyes locked on Margaret's for the final time. "Protect her," he said hoarsely, "because they're coming." Then he turned and disappeared into the forest. The deputies surged forward shouting, but the night swallowed him whole. The sound of his footsteps faded quickly, replaced by the pounding of many others, the shapes moving through the trees. The sheriff ordered everyone into formation, weapons trained, as Margaret held Claire tighter than she ever had before. The reunion she had dreamed of for 9 years had finally come, but it was wrapped in terror, because Richard was gone, and his warning echoed louder than the gunshots in the forest. "They're coming." The forest seemed to hold its breath. Margaret clutched Claire tightly against her chest, her daughter's sobs muffled against her shoulder. The deputies spread into a half circle, rifles raised, flashlights slashing across the tree line. Every man's finger trembled on the trigger. Every breath was sharp and shallow. The sheriff barked for silence, his voice low but firm, and the clearing fell into an eerie stillness. Then came the sound again, the unmistakable crunch of branches under deliberate footsteps. Not one set, but many. Claire's body stiffened in Margaret's arms. She lifted her face, her eyes wide with terror. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's them." Margaret's stomach turned to ice. "Who, Claire?" she begged softly. "Who's out there?" But Claire only shook her head, tears streaking her dirt-smeared cheeks. She pressed her face back into her mother's chest, trembling so hard Margaret could feel it in her bones. The sheriff raised a hand, signaling the deputies to hold their fire. Slowly, carefully, the lights of their flashlights scanned the woods. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, at the farthest edge of the beams, figures emerged. They were tall, broad, and covered in heavy coats that hung like cloaks. Their faces were obscured, hidden under hoods and shadows. There were at least 4 of them, maybe more, standing silently at the edge of the clearing. They did not flinch under the glare of the lights. They simply stood, watching. "Identify yourselves," the sheriff bellowed, his rifle trained on the nearest figure. No reply came. The forest seemed to lean in, amplifying the silence. The deputies shifted uneasily, some muttering curses under their breath. One of the figures stepped forward, just enough for the light to catch the pale of his face beneath the hood. He was older, with deep lines carved across his skin, his eyes black and hollow. When he finally spoke, his voice was gravelly, as though unused for years. "She belongs to us." Margaret's heart nearly stopped. She pulled Claire closer, every protective instinct screaming. "No!" she cried out, her voice shaking but fierce. "She's my daughter." The man's head tilted slightly, his lips curling into something that was not quite a smile. She was chosen, long ago. He knew it. That's why he kept her here. His gaze shifted briefly toward the path where Richard had vanished, then returned to Margaret. He knew the bargain. Margaret's chest tightened, her mind racing. A bargain? Richard's words echoed in her ears. They never stopped following us. Could this be what he meant? Had he been hiding Claire not from the wilderness itself, but from these people? The sheriff stepped forward, his voice steady. "You're trespassing on federal land. Lower your hoods and put your hands where we can see them." The figures did not move. Instead, another stepped forward. This one was taller, his coat darker, his face obscured completely in shadow. His voice was deeper, colder. "The child returns with us, or blood will follow." Claire whimpered, burying her face deeper into Margaret's chest. Margaret shook her head violently, her arms locked like iron around her daughter. "Over my dead body," she hissed. The sheriff raised his rifle higher. "You're not taking anyone. You have one chance to back away." His deputies tightened their stance, weapons aimed, ready to fire at the slightest movement. But the figures didn't retreat. Instead, a low, unsettling sound rolled from their throats, something between a chant and a growl. The sound rippled through the clearing, vibrating in Margaret's chest, raising the hair on her arms. Claire began to sob again, whispering frantically, "Don't let them, Mom! Don't let them take me!" Margaret's heart cracked, but her resolve hardened. She turned her head to the sheriff, her voice raw but strong. "Please, whatever happens, don't let them near her." The sheriff gave a short nod, his jaw tight. He barked orders and the deputies shifted, closing ranks around Margaret and Claire, forming a wall of rifles and flashlights. The chanting grew louder, swelling until it seemed the entire forest vibrated with the sound. Then, without warning, one of the cloaked figures lunged forward, a glint of metal flashing in his hand. A gunshot exploded from the sheriff's rifle, the blast tearing through the night. The figure crumpled to the ground with a guttural cry. Chaos erupted. The remaining figures surged from the tree line, their movements swift and violent. Deputies fired in rapid bursts, muzzle flashes strobing the clearing. Margaret dropped to the ground, shielding Claire with her body as bullets split the air above them. The acrid stench of gunpowder mixed with the sharp scent of pine, the forest exploding with noise and fury. A deputy shouted as one of the cloaked men tackled him, the two struggling in the dirt. Another deputy swung his rifle butt into an attacker's skull, the crack sickening in the night. The sheriff fired again, his face set in grim determination. The battle was close, desperate, primal. Margaret clutched Claire tighter, whispering into her hair, "I've got you, I've got you." Claire shook uncontrollably, her fingers digging into her mother's arms. Amid the chaos, Margaret's eyes darted toward the shadows. For a split second, she saw Richard standing at the tree line, his pistol raised, his face twisted in anguish. He did not move to help the deputies. He didn't rush forward to protect Claire. Instead, he fired into the forest beyond the attackers, his bullets striking at unseen shapes deeper in the dark. His voice carried faintly through the chaos. "You don't see them! You never see them!" Then he was gone again, swallowed by the shadows. The firefight raged for what felt like an eternity, but could not have been more than a few minutes. When it ended, two of the cloaked figures lay dead, their hoods pulled back to reveal faces weathered and scarred by years of wilderness living. The others had retreated, their dark forms vanishing into the trees with uncanny speed. Silence returned, broken only by the ragged breathing of deputies and the distant cries of night birds disturbed by the violence. The sheriff ordered his men to hold position, weapons trained on the tree line. He turned to Margaret, his face grim. "We need to move, now." Before they regrouped, Margaret rose shakily, pulling Claire to her feet. Her daughter clung to her as though she might dissolve if she let go. Margaret looked down at her, brushing tangled hair from her face, her heart aching at the fear etched into her eyes. For the first time in 9 years, she held her daughter again. But instead of relief, only dread filled her chest. Because whatever had stalked them in the Cascades wasn't finished. Richard's words echoed louder than ever. "They're coming." And Margaret realized, with a sick twist in her gut, that the nightmare was only beginning. The clearing reeked of gunpowder and smoke. The acrid haze clung to Margaret's throat as she pulled Claire along, stumbling over roots and rocks. Deputies closed in tightly around them, rifles trained on the forest, their flashlights darting wildly as if the beams themselves might hold the darkness back. The sheriff barked sharp orders, his voice cracking like a whip. "Form up! We move together! Nobody strays! Nobody breaks formation!" Claire's small hand clung to Margaret's sleeve with desperate strength. Her breathing was ragged, uneven, her eyes darting toward the tree line, as though she expected the cloaked figures to reappear at any second. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand, whispering, "I've got you. I won't let go." But inside, her heart was breaking. Claire had spent 9 years in this wilderness, raised in fear, and now even with her mother beside her, she looked as if safety was something she no longer believed in. The group pressed through the trees, following a narrow trail that sloped toward Stronkers, the valley. Every few steps the sheriff stopped, scanning the shadows, listening for the faintest movement. Once, a deputy swore he saw something shift between the trees, but when the flashlights turned, there was nothing. Only the endless black of the Cascades, vast and unyielding. Margaret couldn't stop thinking of Richard. The image of him firing into the trees still burned in her mind, the look of desperation on his face, the wild fear in his eyes. He hadn't been protecting himself. He hadn't even been fighting the deputies. He was shooting at something deeper in the forest, something unseen. She wanted to dismiss it as madness, years of paranoia twisting his mind, but the memory of the cloaked figures and their haunting chant gnawed at her. What if Richard wasn't delusional? What if he had been right all along? The sheriff motioned for silence. Ahead, the trail opened into a wide stretch of rocky ground where the trees thinned. Moonlight spilled across the stones, revealing a view of the valley below. Margaret felt the faintest sense of relief. Beyond the valley lay the ranger road, and if they could reach it, they could radio for help and call in reinforcements. But the sheriff raised his fist, signaling for a halt. His eyes swept the ridgeline. Something wasn't right. Then Margaret heard it too, a low, rhythmic sound drifting on the wind. It was faint at first, almost like the hum of insects. But as it grew louder, it formed into something deliberate, a chant, deep and unbroken, echoing from somewhere in the valley. Claire stiffened instantly. She pressed herself against her mother, her body trembling. "It's them," she whispered, her voice hollow. "They don't stop. They never stop." The deputies tightened their circle, rifles raised, eyes darting. The sheriff cursed under his breath. "Keep moving. Stay close." They started across the rocky ground, their boots crunching on loose gravel. The chant rose louder, rolling through the valley like a wave. It came from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the ridges until it was impossible to tell how many voices there were. 5, 10, 50. Margaret's skin crawled with every syllable, each one carrying a weight that seemed to press into her bones. Suddenly, a flare of light shot up from the tree line below, exploding into a bright red glow that painted the rocks and trees in a hellish hue. The deputies froze, weapons snapping toward the source. Then another flare fired from the opposite ridge, bathing the valley in shifting red shadows. The chanting grew louder, closer, until it seemed the entire forest was alive with it. Claire clutched Margaret's arm, her voice rising into a panicked wail. "They're surrounding us, Mom! They're surrounding us!" The sheriff swore and gestured sharply. "Double time, move." The group broke into a run, the circle tightening around Margaret and Claire. The rocky ground shifted under their boots, but adrenaline drove them forward. Gunfire cracked suddenly from the ridge above. Deputies returned fire, their rifles sparking in the night. Figures darted between the rocks, cloaked shapes moving with uncanny speed. Bullets tore into stone, sending shards flying. Margaret ducked low, shielding Claire, as the air erupted with violence again. One deputy went down with a cry, blood soaking his sleeve. Another dragged him up, hauling him toward the group as they pushed forward. The sheriff fired methodically, his face grim, his body moving with the precision of a man who had seen too many battles. "Keep going," he roared. Margaret stumbled, nearly falling, but Claire's small hands pulled at her, urging her on. They reached a stand of pines at the valley's edge, the trail dipping steeply toward the ranger road. Relief flickered in Margaret's chest. If they could make it down, they might have a chance. But just as they began their descent, a sound split the night. A long, piercing horn, low and unnatural, echoing from the forest depths. The chant stopped instantly. Silence fell like a hammer. Even the gunfire ceased. The sudden stillness was worse than the noise, a suffocating blanket of dread that pressed down on them. Margaret's breath came in ragged bursts, her ears straining. Then, from the shadows at the base of the ridge, movement stirred. Figures emerged, dozens this time, not cloaked but carrying torches that burned with an orange glow. Their faces were painted with streaks of ash and earth, their eyes glinting in the firelight. They moved in unison, a wall of silent menace advancing slowly up the valley toward them. Claire buried her face into Margaret's chest, sobbing. "It's them. It's all of them. He told me they'd never stop." The sheriff's jaw clenched. He raised his rifle, his voice firm but laced with urgency. "We're falling back. Keep tight. Don't break formation." As the group scrambled down the slope, Margaret's eyes darted across the valley, searching desperately for Richard. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw him high on the ridge, his figure barely visible against the red flare light. His pistol glinted as he fired into the advancing mass, his voice carrying faintly on the wind. "Run. Run while you can." Then he vanished into the trees again, swallowed as though the forest itself claimed him. Margaret clutched Claire tighter, her body shaking with exhaustion and terror. She whispered into her daughter's hair, promising over and over, "I won't lose you again. I swear I won't." But as the torches multiplied in the valley and the horn bellowed again, Margaret knew the fight was far from over. Richard's warning echoed in her mind like a curse. They're coming. And now, for the first time, she believed him. The descent into the valley was chaos. Deputies fired in bursts, muzzle flashes tearing through the night as the advancing wall of torchlight pressed closer. The chanting had returned, louder now, rising and falling in waves that rattled Margaret's teeth. Claire stumbled beside her, but Margaret refused to let go of her hand, dragging her down the slope with all the strength left in her body. The sheriff shouted orders, his voice raw, pushing his men to cover their retreat. Bullets cracked through the trees, splinters raining down, but the torchbearers never faltered. They moved with steady purpose, as if no amount of firepower could slow them. One deputy went down with a cry. Another cursed as his rifle jammed. The line was breaking. Then above the chaos, a single gunshot rang out from the ridge. All eyes turned upward. There, silhouetted against the burning glow of the flares, stood Richard. His figure was stark against the sky, pistol in one hand, his body rigid with defiance. He fired again, the shot echoing across the valley. The torchbearers paused, their chant faltering. For the briefest moment, the advance slowed. Richard's voice carried down through the smoke and fire. "You want me, not her. Leave her alone." Margaret's breath caught. She saw it then, the truth written on his face, even from a distance. Richard had been running all these years, not out of madness, but out of sacrifice. He had become their shield, their distraction, bearing the weight of something Margaret still could not fully understand. His life had been swallowed by the mountain to keep Claire hidden. The figures turned their attention to him, their chant shifting, rising like a storm. Richard fired again, and again until the pistol clicked empty. Then he dropped the weapon and raised his arms wide, shouting a wordless cry that shook the night. The torchbearers surged toward him, leaving the valley floor. The sheriff seized the moment. "Move! Now!" Deputies grabbed Margaret and Claire, pulling them down the last stretch of the slope. Margaret twisted in their grip, screaming Richard's name, her voice breaking. But she was dragged onward, her daughter clutched to her chest. while the sounds of the forest swallowed Richard's final stand. At last, they burst onto the Ranger Road. Patrol vehicles waited, lights flashing, reinforcements rushing to meet them. Claire collapsed against Margaret, sobbing, her thin body trembling with exhaustion. Deputies formed a barricade, weapons trained back toward the valley, but the torchlight did not follow. The chanting faded into the trees, as if the forest itself had drawn a line they would not cross. Margaret sank to her knees, holding Claire as tightly as she could. For the first time in 9 years, she had her daughter in her arms, but it came with a hollow ache. Richard was gone. Whether dead, taken, or lost forever in the Cascades, she did not know. All she had was his last act, a sacrifice to save the child he had kept hidden for so long. The sheriff crouched beside her, his face grim. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Whatever they are, whoever they are, they'll come again." Margaret nodded slowly, stroking Claire's tangled hair. "Then I'll be ready," she whispered. The flashing lights of the patrol cars cut through the night, casting long shadows against the towering trees. And high on the ridges,